Always helps if the sermon's right side up and the screen's on. There it is. Daring greatly for Jesus. We've been talking about that since the beginning of the year. It's the theme, and then Easter got in the way, so we had to talk about Jesus. You're supposed to laugh at that, just so you know. What does it mean? What does it take to dare greatly for Jesus? Well, as we've done some studies with the elders and as we've been asking questions in different places, one of the things that keeps coming back to the pastoral staff here is that we need to really work on what makes daring greatly for Jesus possible. And that is discipleship. And that means that we've got to think about what it means to be a disciple and how that calls us to live and act every day. Because being a disciple of Jesus isn't just about what we do on Sunday morning. It's not about what we do in public. It's not about what we do anywhere but everywhere. So I thought we better start talking about discipleship, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about what in the world is a disciple. Now, how many of you were paying attention to the kids? It's hard not to pay attention to them, but did you hear them? You know, kids are sometimes hard to hear, right? We all have trouble hearing our kids, right? I've never had any trouble hearing my kids. If you heard our children this morning, they talked about being a disciple means following Jesus. And not just on Sunday morning, but on Monday and Tuesday, and on Friday and Saturday. When it's easy and when it's hard, when it's complicated and when it's simple. So what does it mean? So what does it mean to be a disciple? You see, we don't even talk about being a disciple very often. And folks, that's going to change at First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. You know, when our denomination got its start way back in the 1800s, we had this debate. The debate was over what in the world is the name of our church going to be. Now, they weren't talking about the local church where about 97.5% of them are called First Christian Church. I always wondered, how could there be so many First Christian churches? You know, and I lived in one town that actually had 2 First Christian churches. You think the postman wasn't confused? Everybody wants to be first. Nobody wants to be second. One of my favorite churches in Illinois was actually the one that called themselves Second Baptist Church of Evanston, Illinois. They were unique. And they were fun. In the early 1800s, Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone decided to come together and make a new church. A church that was different than all of the other churches around, and a church that was having its birth on the frontier. And they got together and they decided they were going to bring their 2 groups together. And we had on the one side, we had the Christians. That's you all. Say, we're the Christians. All right. And on the other side, we had the people who said, no, we're the disciples of Christ. And you know what? Between those 2 groups, on day 1, there was an aisle. And one side, the Christians sat here and the disciples sat here, and they couldn't figure out what to do. So you know what they did? Somebody suggested at the early service they had a committee meeting. And they probably did. It was probably made up of Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. Because they really didn't think too kindly about committees. There was. So they decided that they would just have one name, and it was the Christian Church, parentheses, Disciples of Christ. Now, I always wonder why we put parentheses on there. So, from our very beginning, our church has said, we're going to be disciples of Christ. In other words, we're going to be the ones out there following Jesus wherever Jesus goes, doing whatever Jesus does, we're going to do it. So how are we doing on that? And how do you get to be a disciple? Well, we'll talk a lot about that next week, but no one comes to be a disciple of Jesus Christ without Jesus calling them. Now, let me tell you something else. It's really important for us to understand this. You cannot be a Christian and not be a disciple. And just so you know, you cannot be a disciple and not be a... Does everybody understand that? Those two words, Christian and disciple, are interchangeable in Scripture. In fact, I will tell you that the word Christian, let's see if you are smarter than the first service. How many of you think you all are smarter than the first service? Bonnie thinks she's smarter, so this test is for Bonnie. Y'all ready? How many times, ready? How many times does the word Christian appear in Scripture? 3 times? 3. Say, the first group didn't get it either. You know, sometimes I ask questions and give you the answer. And sometimes I'm sneaky. But in reality, in the New Testament, the word Christian shows up this many times. Turn to a neighbor and say 3 times. 3 times, choir. All right. Now, how many times, and if you were at first service, you can't tell, choir, Glenn, Bill, Joe. Did you put it on the screen? Oh. How many times does the word disciple show up in the New Testament? A bunch. Somebody venture a guess. 30. Hundreds. 269 times the word disciple shows up. So Christians are disciples and disciples are, which means if you believe in Jesus, you are both a and a bingo. So, in the dictionary, by definition of disciple, guess whose picture's there? Yours. Yours. How do you feel about that? Awesome, I like that. Good job, Paul. How many of you are just a little nervous about that? How many of you didn't know that you knew Webster? You see, when it comes right down to this disciple thing, we love to be, well, until today, we loved being called Christian. And now that the preacher's telling you that there's more to it than just being Christian, that it's really about being a disciple, and that being a disciple actually requires you to do some things. do some things. Now, the preacher's gone from being nice to meddling, and I got new boots to step on your toes with. John just pulled his feet back. Smart man. You see, this idea about being a disciple sounds really good and nice and wonderful, especially if you're a part of the First Christian Church Disciples of Christ, because then you can just say, well, that's my church. I'm a disciple. And then I'm going to ask you some questions. Questions like, really? Are you acting like it? I'm not pointing any fingers. Some of you are. Some of you are getting a little nervous because you know what you did last night. Or Friday. Or Wednesday. You see, this idea of being a disciple, well, if you read the scripture that we just read, not only are we called to be disciples, but then the Gospel of Luke tells us some really tough things, like today's reading. If you do not hate your mother and father, your wife, your children, your whoever's, and follow me, you can't be my disciple. We don't like that passage. Because after all, the church for thousands of years has been saying, don't hate anybody. Isn't that right, Paul? You're not supposed to hate anybody, are you? Guess what? Jesus just said, if you don't hate your mother and father, your wife, your children, you can't be my disciple. Anybody want to scratch their head too? How can we do that? Of course, then Jesus tries to make it easier because, you know, we want to love our mother, and we want to love our father, and we want to love our brothers and sisters, and we want to love people. And after all, we want to be what Jesus said, and that means love everybody. We heard Paul say that earlier today, right? I'm having this conversation with Paul over here to keep him engaged. Laz, too. It's working. Now, Jesus goes on, he says, oh, by the way, if you don't pick up your own cross and follow me, you can't be my disciple. Now, I love that passage because, quite frankly, I don't want to pick up Johnny's cross. I have enough trouble with my own. But we don't even like picking up a cross, do we? That's about burdens and carrying our own stuff and giving it to Jesus. You see, that's what that's really about. When you have your own cross, you're taking it to Jesus, letting him have it. Most of us want to carry our cross and keep it because it gives us excuses. Over and over and over again in Scripture, we're told things like, pick up your cross and follow me. Come, follow me. I'll change you from fishermen to fishers of men. Scripture says things like to the rich young ruler, take all that you have, sell it, and give the money away, and come, follow me. And we go, this being a disciple is hard work. It means we got to change. We don't like that change word very much. I'll tell you what, I've been the pastor here almost 4 years now in September. And you know, you all still flinch when I say the word change. Well, not all of you. But some of you. Some of you are even pointing fingers. That's good. Yeah, we all like to do that. They don't like to change, and they don't like to change, and they don't like to change. Jesus likes to change. Jesus likes to change people. Jesus likes to change situations. Jesus likes to change your frowns into smiles. Most of the time, we don't like change because we like to hold on to what we got. We like to hold on because if we keep my trouble, then I know where I live. And freedom's hard. And change brings freedom. So Jesus is out with the disciples and the crowd that day. He's trying to help them understand what it means to be a disciple. You can't be a disciple and be a part of the crowd. Being a disciple is sometimes lonely. Being a disciple is about doing what Jesus says when Jesus says to do it. Doesn't mean waiting till next week to do what Jesus told you. I love the story that was read for the first text. Jesus said, "Come follow me." And Peter and Andrew dropped their nets right then and went. They got to James and John, and he said, "James and John, come follow me." James and John threw the nets back to the hired hands and to Dad and said, "See you later. We're going to go. Follow Jesus." So how can you do that? Well, there are some things that disciples do. For example, disciples do, the kids were right, read their Bibles. I had a professor who said, "I can always tell what kind of people church people are by going to their living room and looking at the state of their Bibles. Are they open? Are they well worn? Do they have thumbprints on them? Or are they laid out in a nice, pristine picture? Never read." You know, some of you, well, with the exception probably of Dottie this morning, some of you are not as young as you used to be. Now, I know you're really surprised by that. I know you're really surprised that you're not as young as you used to be, but on Thursday mornings, we have a Bible study. There's about 12 to 15 to 18 people that show up for Bible study on Thursday morning. Now, we realize that some of you actually have jobs during the day. Don't quit your job to come to Bible study unless God tells you to. But, you know, I'd love to have to move from the classroom we're in to the fellowship hall so we can have Bible study. I'd love to move that group from 15 to 20 to about 50 every Thursday morning. And I know that some of you are available. I know that some of you don't do anything on Thursday. You just wake up and there you are. Want to be a better disciple? Come and study the Gospel of Luke. We're talking about radical discipleship on Thursday mornings. Want to be a better disciple? Work on your prayer life. How many of you pray? How many of you pray like this? "Oh, God, help!" When things, yeah, sometimes. How many of you practice prayer on a regular basis? How many of you lift your voices to God every night before you go to bed and when you wake up? And how often do we meet with prayer groups? And there's going to be more of those. More opportunities. Want to be a better disciple? Learn to love like Jesus loved, and that means by serving and helping take care of things. Sheila says there's places on the board out front that needs to be signed up. We need sandwich makers, and we need cooks, and we need servers, and we need people to pray for the team that goes out on Saturdays. Being a better disciple means stepping up to fill some of those spots. Come next Sunday and you can find out how and more. You see, We're talking about that because the leadership of this church realizes that as disciples, we do serving. And we touch lives. And we love people right where they are, even if it's underneath a bridge in the middle of Dallas. And even if it's your next door neighbor. I was so excited. I had 2 people in the elders group say, we need to help with Meals on Wheels. We need to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, do what it takes to be like Jesus. You see, if you're going to define discipleship, you have to look at who you're the disciple of. And our name says it all. We are disciples of Christ, not of ourselves, not of our community, not of our social world. And that means we cannot let anything come between us and Jesus. Because that's what a disciple does.